Excellent. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody, or good evening, depending on where you are connecting. Welcome to this webinar on interdisciplinary pathways towards evidence-driven air quality management in Africa. My name is Nancy Lozano Gracia from the World Bank Group Institute for Economic Development, and I'll be your moderator today. We are co-organizing this event with the Africa Clean Air Network, and I'm delighted to have you with us. So while we're here, I don't think I need to preach to the converted, like they say. All of us are here because we think or we agree that air pollution is one of the most pressing issues in the developing world, yet it is actually underrepresented among the development challenges that we often discuss. We know it's really, or it can bring a public health crisis. It has impacts on outcomes, on productivity. It also has impacts on economic growth, but yet the tools that we need to address them are not at the point that we would want them to be. The data to see it, the institutions to govern it, to manage it, and even the markets to allow to incentivize change are underdeveloped in most of low and middle income countries today. So we all know this, but why is it that the conversation today is different? Because we're trying to have a different starting point. We often gathered only among our own disciplines, and today we're trying to break that barrier that often exists across disciplines. We're gathering among engineers and scientists and economists and policies makers, and we want to ask, what is it that these two disciplines that I'm gonna refer from now on as engineers, as economists, what is it that these two disciplines can learn from each other? Most importantly, what is it that becomes possible when we bring these two disciplines together? So this is where we want, or the conversation that we want to start today. This webinar is also a first step into what we see as a longer journey. We want to start the conversation today. We want it to be a starting point for bringing the community together later on in the Clean Air Forum that is happening in July in Pretoria. We'll come back to this at the end so that everybody is aware of this. We hope to deepen the conversation there, but we're starting it today. So basically, the message to our panelists, whatever you say today matters not only for today, it matters beyond these 90 minutes that we have you here today. So we're listening carefully. Just some housekeeping for everybody. The session, as you might have seen, is being recorded. And we will be able to share it with you and other colleagues after we close. We will first have our four presenters give their presentations, about 10 minutes each. We will then have a discussion for about 20-25 minutes with our guest presenters. And then we'll open for questions from the floor. I believe the chat option should be available, so feel free to put questions, submit questions, and then we can pick them up at the end. So without any further comments, let me pass on to our presenters. And our first presenter today is Deo Kure from ERCO and Makerere University. The ERCO is, for those of you that do not know, is one of the pioneer African initiatives really developing affordable, locally adapted air quality monitor solutions. And Deo and his team at ERCO and Makerere University have actually built one of the most extensive low-cost sensor networks in the continent, deploying them across several African cities. So in the discussion today, Deo's work represents the engineer frontier of this agenda, efforts to make pollution visible in places that where pollution was not visible before. Deo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nancy, for the overview and for the introduction, and delighted to be here to share some experiences in how we are contributing in some way to close to address the problem that we all are familiar with. So if you can just confirm if my screen is visible.
Looks well, thank you.
All right. So my part of the talk today is really to share some experiences on how we are scaling continuous monitoring in the region, as Nancy said, to try and make this visible, the invisible visible. Eric has already been introduced. You're welcome to get in touch with us. Very open to always collaborating with everybody. And also to hear what other people are doing in the space. But in brief, we really exist to try and contribute to strengthening capacity in the region, particularly by building and deploying a scalable open infrastructure for data to allow us to collect the data, analyze the data, but also to use this to take action. I do want to start by giving some contextual background about air pollution in Africa. And don't worry, I won't talk about the number of premature deaths in Africa, but just kind of more broadly, one that in the continent, we see that the challenge of air pollution is shared. There are shared challenges, whether it's access to ground monitoring data, whether it's on ability for us to collaborate or public participation through awareness, but also looking at the policy, because as a matter of fact, we see that policy development to tackle air pollution actually still very much in the initial stages, infancy stages or nascent stages in many countries in the region. And I can say for sure that more than 40% are yet to have, for example, an equal legislation, which is supposed to be like a first step. So there is a lot of room to grow in terms of how to close these capacity gaps. And we also see that a lot of the work that has happened, and we've documented this through scoping review, that a lot of the interventions tend to be coming, we are getting action through the core benefits, which is great. But at the same time, I think we need to move towards having some more tailored action. And I like today's conversation because trying to have that bridge between disciplines that allows us to, we're developing all these solutional knowledge products, from different comfort zones, but at the same time, how do we sort of like bring all those different pieces together for us to advance action? Coming on to the data piece, I want to start by acknowledging that there's been this steady growth really in terms of building capacity for data or continuous data, continuous here being deliberate, because when air quality challenge or the air pollution challenge is not something that happens as an event, it's going to be it's continuous. It's something that even if you put in place all the measures, all the interventions, you've managed to clear the air and everything is all good, you need to be able to monitor that, on a continuous basis, because one, you also want to know the progress, but you also want to see where the gaps are, the emerging issues. So that's why we cannot run away from having a continuous infrastructure, because that allows us to really take action and all be progressive with action. But what you see here is that there's been some progress, although while that is happening, that's still a tiny drop in the ocean. If you try to do some work to really compile the total number of continuous monitoring units in the region, and this is bringing us to about maybe less than 1,500 comparatively, because as you see in my screen, that that is nowhere compared to what you see, in the fairly more advanced economies, whether it's the EU, whether the USA, or in other parts of the world. So, but what's also coming out is the fact that we are seeing more innovation. In fact, the region is becoming, if I may, like a test bed for refining application of local sensors, which is great. And from a philosophical point of view, we also see that a lot of the monitoring networks are coming from non-government-led initiatives. So if you're thinking about something that maybe other people could learn from the region, is the fact that progressively we are demonstrating how non-government-led interventions can actually be able to generate data that can be used for monitoring or to cause change beyond just what you know as research. And I think that's something really, really important. And I'm going to demonstrate in the next slides on how some of the use cases, especially from the air core side of things. I also want to highlight that when you're talking about reliable data, it's not just about installation. It's also about ability to, one, make sure the infrastructure is reliable. There's a people in terms of having access to the data, and so on and so on. And then, of course, our colleagues are talking about Earth observation. There's also increasing uptake of satellite data, remote sensing for air quality. Maybe going to the specifics now. I mentioned about the local sensors. How do we have what do we see the sensor networks playing? Again, from a technical point of view, how are the sensor networks playing in terms of closing data gaps, and how can we strengthen the data flows? So I hope this is going to have some useful information. This particular slide that sort of tries to offer that contrast side by side in terms of what we ordinarily know as conventional monitoring or kind of an elaborate setting versus what we are seeing happen in Africa through the use of sensors. So when you talk about cost, or what qualifies cost when it comes to monitoring units or monitoring technology. So there's three elements in terms of the cost. One is, of course, the cost of the purchase cost. So if we're looking for a contrast, the first element, I guess, which is fairly obvious to many people, is the cost of monitoring units. So on the one hand, you've got the reference instrument costing thousands of dollars, and then on the other hand, because you have the cost, anything ranging between 100, and that is for sensors that could be used meaningfully for outdoor monitoring, between $100 and $2,500. We've summarized this in one of the earlier works, and you're welcome to look it up. The other cost element is installation and maintenance. What does it cost to set up this infrastructure? As you can see on my screen, you're having this very elaborate setup with security installations, a lot going on, power, quite a lot of work for it to go. And then on the other hand, you've got having just two sensor boxes just deployed, which will take a couple of minutes to have it installed. So as you can see visibly, you see that there's a mismatch in terms of the cost implication of setting up a reference session versus the monitoring versus a sensor unit. Then, of course, you have data retrieval and access. What this means is just having the box, that's not sufficient, but how do you get the data from these monitoring units to whatever, to moving it to the action pipeline, whether it's for the public or for the researchers, or for think of all the different stakeholder groups that would need to access the data. So the mechanism to move the data from the equipment to where it needs to be, it's also another cost dimension. So we've got three different buckets in terms of looking at the cost. So if the cost elements across all these major pieces are comparatively lower, then obviously that qualifies. You know what to do in terms of the cost. So I want to come down to the sense a little bit, look at how the progress in the uptake. So did some summaries looking at the scientific production or peer-reviewed publications on local sensors over a 20-year period. This is coming from Scopus. You see that there's a steady growth in terms of annual production, scientific production. But at the same time, with the sensors, of course, come the computational capabilities. And that's why you see lots of people trying to build dashboards to access the data, again, addressing the other cost element I mentioned earlier about data access. Then, of course, the ability to be able to get this data more frequently, and lots of other benefits, of course, including with cost also comes the ability to acquire multiple units. That means you can have higher resolution in terms of monitoring. However, there are things that need to be looked into, and those are some of the constraints, the specific constraints that can hinder the uptake of sensor data or the utility over time. So one, we need to do these real world evaluations, because whereas the sensors are very portable, they can work, they're also affected by some environmental factors that can easily affect the way they perform. Obviously, look at some of the infrastructural questions around the hardware options not being configured to work in our setting, and think about things like electricity or internet connectivity and so on and so on. And then, of course, I spoke about the mechanism to access data, to retrieve the data. A lot of this, that is not always obvious. I know there's lots of work happening in the space to try to close this gap, but it goes without saying that we need to, there's work that needs to happen. Just having a sensor box might not be sufficient. So I'll spend just a few minutes on this summary. This is looking at what would see as an integrated kind of framework for monitoring. On the one hand, you've got the network side, that's the local the sensor boxes. On the other hand, of course, you also need to have the management infrastructure for data credibility, and this includes access to a local reference instrument, which has been a barrier in many cases. Then obviously having the community ownership. What I mean by ownership is that you need some community participation, right, starting from at the level of designing, setting up the network itself, in some instances even the choice of the technology, but also in terms of the data utility, because you also get the feedback loop in terms of, well, we need to do this, we need to do that, these are the needs. So how you need community at the center. And when I say community, I'm looking at the broader stakeholder group, not just community in terms of, the people, but rather community in terms of, the policymakers, the researchers, the actual users, the people are supposed to add value to the data. Just for visualization purposes, so this is what we've done at TEACO in terms of building this, look at this as an end-to-end sort of process where you have technology selection. You've got to have the, building platforms to look at things of data, credibility, quality assurance, but also having that loop where the community actively giving feedback, of course, plus other use cases, but more uniquely looking at how we can apply modeling capabilities to also add value, because just having rows of data doesn't mean anything. But if I'm able to say what is going to be, the air quality situation in the next, say, 7 days, in the next, maybe the next hour, that's something we've been actively doing at ERCO. A lot of this work has been published, but also you can access it through the different channels. So I want to conclude by giving just look at these three kind of reflection points. That one, for us to be able to take meaningful action, that requires a lot of resources, which tend to be prohibitive, especially in low resource communities when you're looking at other competing priorities. So that then means we need to think differently, have all these new approaches, and where we can optimize on cost. And that includes, of course, interdisciplinary pathways. If we can be able to figure out how best to work together, allows us to share resources and collaborate better. That will be really important. Secondly, having a monitoring system, it should address at least three. A functional system should be able to address three core issues. The first one being understanding what is optimal, what is acceptable in terms of the monitoring, the number of monitoring units we need for a given airshed has the first point. The second point is really to ensure that the data is accurate and credible. In other words, can we use it to take action that can be, can we use it authoritatively to be able to take action and move action without, just limiting ourselves to talking about awareness or raising the profile of air pollution, but rather using the data and being able to rely on the data to take meaningful action. Then, of course, the third point really, which is the third key tenet, is that data access and utility is critical. And that does not just happen when you have the data itself, but rather there's some different strategies you need to deploy. And a robust system should be able to also anticipate and address itself to the need to, have the data accessible, but also actively utilize. And lastly, which kind of ties into the 2 points, is really we need to always have strengthen and scale the coordination efforts, but with a particular focus on, looking at how we can strengthen evidence-driven actions. And I think I'm going to pause here. I will share these resources, but thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dale, for this presentation. I think it was really interesting how you emphasize what it takes to, as you said at the beginning, to make the invisible visible. It doesn't stop us at installation. You said it takes infrastructure, it takes people. So it was a really nice summary for everybody here on what it takes to take that step. Let me now introduce our second speaker of today, Pawan Gupta. He's a scientist at NASA working on the use of satellites and remote sensing data to measure air quality in data scarce environments. So Pawan and his team work in many parts of Africa and South Asia, where actually ground level monitoring networks are sparse or absent. So in these places, satellite data can fill a very critical gap. And we're gonna hear from Pawan about this work. Their work actually brings what we can call a view from above, and with it different possibilities of measuring what Dale, how Dale referred to it, making the invisible visible. So Pawan, the floor is yours. I'll ask you to keep an eye on the chat. I'll flag when you have 2 or 3 minutes left. Thank you.
Sounds great. And you can see my slide, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Nancy. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm going to talk about what is out there from the satellite and how we can use them, focusing more on Africa. Okay, let's see if I can next. Okay, so the first question I want to address is why satellite data matters, right? So to answer that question, we have to address the current monitoring gap, which a previous speaker kind of emphasized. And I think I don't want to repeat all those things, but we all know there is a huge gap in monitoring, either using reference grid or these low-cost sensors across Africa, and large part of population lives nearby where there's no monitor, so there is essentially no information. So I think the gap is well identified and we all know about it. So how satellite can offer? So satellite, irrespective of places, they Most of the satellite looks entire globe, entire planet, and they have repetitive cycles. Some of them are daily, some of them are multiple times in a day, depending on their orbit. They deliver broad spatial coverage with almost no geophysical boundaries, and often can be very well collocated with ground networks to validate their values. And when we are talking about regions with limited infrastructure, satellite can actually fill that gap to provide that essential data sets. So let's move on to the next one. So when we talk about the satellite data, there are many different data sets which satellite can provide on related to air pollution. One of the one which my group focus is aerosols or particulate matter. In people who use the satellite data, they have heard this terminology called aerosol optical depth, and I will explain this and how it is related to PM2.5 in a minute. But aerosol or particulate matter is one of the thing which satellite can provide. Trace gases such as NO2, SO2, CO, and ozone. These are all the gases which actually satellite does have some information or can quantify from the space. Satellite data has been also very successful in monitoring and detecting the fires on the ground and the smoke which emits from these fires and transport to the local to regional to the longer global scale. So fire and smoke is a huge, and of course the dust storms, monitoring the dust storm and its transport to the various parts of the world is again another aspect of the satellite data which so let me just briefly mention the aerosol optical depth is a optical property of atmospheric aerosols. It represents the loading of aerosol in the entire column. It depends on how the aerosols or the particulate matters are, whether they're absorbing or scattering type. It can be measured from the ground using different instrument called sun photometers, and it can also be observed or retrieved using space-based or satellite-based observation. So this is very briefly, there is a mathematical term. I don't want to get into details, but it is measured at different wavelength. Typically 550 nanometer is the standard wavelength at which we measure. So let me just introduce you how this aerosol optical depth is connected to the PM2.5 or the visibility or air pollution at the surface. So in this picture, what you're seeing are the two pictures. One is on the left, taken on July 2nd. It's a very old picture from Pittsburgh here. And when you measure the PM2.5 in the ground, it shows about 45 microgram per cubic meter, and then the aerosol optical depth was around 0.8. Now, the same place, same time, another picture is taken 2 weeks later, where the ground measured PM2.5 only 4 microgram per cubic meter and AOD was 0.1. So you can see that the reduction in visibility between the left and right is well captured in PM2.5 values and well captured in change in aerosol optical depth values. So from this, what it indicate that both AOD and PM2.5 are related in some ways. There are differences, and I will not get into the details, but AOD can be served as a proxy to monitor the PM2.5 at the surface. So what are the different steps in order to get this air quality index or PM2.5 from the satellite? Satellites acquires these data, which we can convert into this aerosol optical depth. We can collocate that with ground measurements to validate. We can build this model, whether they are regression based, simple statistical model, or more advanced machine learning based model, or a geophysical model. And any of that mechanism can be used to convert that AOD into PM2.5, and then you can come up with these nice looking maps that can be converted into air quality index or air quality category as defined by environmental protection agencies in many countries or WHO guideline. So as I mentioned earlier, satellite does provide many different ways in which we can look the pollution. Uh, but specifically, the current capabilities of satellite includes aerosol, dust, smoke, NOx, sulfate, ozone. Ozone is more difficult because most of the ozone stays in stratosphere. So near surface ozone getting from satellite is a little bit difficult. Carbon monoxide, and more recently we have formaldehyde and methane and ammonia as well, which we can actually get from the satellite. In terms of decision support, uses of the satellite data, of course, emission inventories, and it's you can develop emission inventories, you can verify the existing trend analysis because we have long term of records from the satellites, almost 25 plus years, good data sets which you can use for trend analysis, and that will actually demonstrate the policy implementation in and its impact. Regulatory compliance, satellite data are still in very early stage to do that. Most of the developed countries who use the satellite data, they use as a complement data sets, but not replacing the ground data. Uh, Pollution transport, the boundary pollution transport tracking, satellites are excellent tool actually. It's very hard to do that using the ground data, but satellite can do that very effectively. And many studies have been published in last 10-15 years which actually used satellite based estimates to do the human population exposure and public health exposure studies. So that's another thing, and when you use the satellite data into the model, of course you can do the forecasting and alert system, public health alerts type things. I want to just focus 1 minute on some of the work which we are doing as part. So we uh, our team of folks here at NASA Goddard in Washington, D.C., and we have part of this NASA Health and Air Quality Applied Science team, under which we are developing this a one-stop shop called African Air Quality Explorer, uh, and that will have many different component of it. One of them will be a high resolution PM 2.5 data sets, which will be generated using Meteosat third generation satellite, which was launched 2 years ago. So this will allow us to give 2 kilometer resolution every hour, every 10 minute PM 2.5 over African continent. So this work is in the early stage right now. We are also developing some aerosol products over Africa, including from the Aeronet, and combining that with satellite data. So that will also be available. That goes beyond the PM 2.5 but provides size distribution and other things. We already have an operational forecasting system which you can access using this link, which provides actually air quality forecast for next 3 days. And currently it has about 800 or 1,000 cities across Africa, which you can access through API or through the web. And then finally, we are developing this AI-based platform called Vayu, which the word taken is from the Sanskrit, and that will allow you to interact with our data sets in the same way as you do using Google or ChatGPT, but this will be powered by the NASA data. So these are some of the upcoming things. We will talk about this more when we meet in the meeting next month in South Africa. We will have demo and more ways to access and provide a training on this. So that's all I have. I think this is just last slide. We all know the strength and limitation. Major limitation of the satellite data is the clouds, under cloud and snow. We cannot observe them. There is, of course, larger uncertainties than the ground measurements. So those are some of the things which we have to be careful when we start using the data. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pawan, and thank you for staying perfectly on time. So I think yours and Deo's presentation from before, I started talking about complementarities and how bringing two very different disciplines, engineers and economists together, we want to push a joint agenda, but really your presentation and there reminds us that there are strong complementarities also to build on even within one discipline, and in this case, measurement and monitoring from the ground, from the sky, if you want to say it. So let us now move to our third presenter, Kaushik Deb, from the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago, EPIC, India. EPIC has produced, for those of you maybe that are not familiar with this work, EPIC has produced some of the most rigorous economic analysis of air pollution in South Asia and beyond, including very innovative work on emission trading systems and distributional impacts of air pollution. So Kaushik, you will help us now remove the engineer's glasses and put on the economist glasses to help us think how to design incentives, measures the cost of inaction, and start thinking about investments in clean air. Kaushik, the floor is yours. You're muted.
Thank you, Nancy. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we
Yes.
can. Thank you.
Perfect. And you can see my slides?
Yes, they look great.
Great. Thank you, Nancy. This is really a fun conversation to be a part of, and to follow Dio and Pawan is really, really exciting. I also wanted to kind of quickly say hello to Pallavi, who I think is kind of orchestrating all of this behind the scenes and who's been such a great supporter and proponent of the work that we do and really the work that she does. So to kind of start us off, let me flag one thing very, very obviously and clearly. I absolutely understand why a multidisciplinary and integrated approach to dealing with air quality is so central to us being able to solve the problem. And that's really something that I have learned during the course of my career, and something that we try and operationalize very, very actively as we work through solutions to deal with poor air quality. And all of that kind of stems from recognizing the fact that while it's really uh, amazing and great to be able to kind of sit in a university and write out a excellent academic paper that goes into a top rated journal, to be able to kind of find that paper actually changing lives and making a difference is really the bridge that we are trying to at this point cross at the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago. And that's really what I want to talk about. So first of all, let me kind of just flag why this is so central to what we are doing. We've established that air quality is the biggest health and environmental risk and challenge to our entire civilization. It's bigger than malaria, it's bigger than transportation accidents, it's bigger than alcohol, tobacco, HIV/AIDS. And we know that because we've developed this tool called the Air Quality Life Index that measures what the impact of poorer air quality has on health and on life years lost. And the way we do that is to use a lot of the tools and data that Pawan and Dio were talking about, where we are able to estimate what is the observed level of PM 2.5 in each of these jurisdictions around the world that you can see on this map, and compare it with the recommended national standard or the WHO standard, and establish what that difference is, what establish the impact that difference is having in terms of number of years lost. So really be able to use all of these scientific and engineering tools and data generated from there and be able to establish what that actually means. And I think kind of this is a central part of how we approach the problem, in the sense that being able to measure it correctly and be able to kind of measure it in a manner that allows for everyone across the world, across the entire stakeholder spectrum, understand what that measurement actually means is so very important. The unfortunate thing, and something that kind of we did see in these really remarkable pictures around Africa, is that the world's most polluted cities are almost all in the global south. It's estimated that 49 of the 50 most polluted cities globally are in the global south. But this is also that part of the world that has the least amount of information actively available. And that's a huge gap that I think all of us are grappling with and also trying to solve. Using satellite data gets us quite a bit down the path where we are able to establish what these numbers would look like. With whatever limitations that there are, we are kind of increasingly getting better and better in being able to use 30,000 feet level data as well as ground level measurements and see exactly what that data looks like. One of the things that I want to kind of flag here that we are involved with is the Air Quality Fund that we launched a few years back that essentially allows for jurisdictions in the global south to apply for funding to be able to obtain air quality monitors and be able to kind of make that information available for their own particular context, but also more globally and widely that we and other researchers can use to be able to measure what's the air quality level and for us to be able to kind of take the next step and see what that actually means in terms of health impacts. The other part that I wanted to also flag, and this is where my economist hat comes on, is that these parts of the world are also the ones that are generally considered to have the least and the most unsophisticated regulatory capacity. And that's always been a very, very big challenge in the sense that with limited capacity, with limited resources, we are expecting to solve this problem that's almost kind of completely pervasive in the global south. And the reliance here essentially is on really old and complicated technology solutions in terms of measuring air quality and then being able measuring emissions from polluting stacks, for instance, and being able to penalize them. What we want to do is be able to use that information, identify and estimate the impact of that information, so that air quality data, identify what interventions across which sectors can make a big difference, estimate the cost of those interventions as well as the potential benefit of what those interventions could be, and finally, do it in a manner that we are able to develop solutions that are replicable and can be used across a variety of jurisdictions. And hence, this global south to global south learning can happen much, much more actively. This is where information is so central to everything that we are doing. Because once we have information, once we have this data, and that data is publicly available, then people can actually demand action. If I look at an air quality monitor somewhere in the city, and that tells me that the concentration of PM is some 353 micrograms per something, it really does not make a person understand what that number is. But translating it into, for instance, the number of years of your life lost, then becomes something that starts to create traction for action from our citizenry, but also that allows for regulators to be able to identify what the problem is. And they can start to target enforcement where that problem can be most solved. And policymakers then have the opportunity to be able to design interventions that make the biggest impact. And all of that then creates the ecosystem where firms, the polluters in this case, actually are able to take informed decisions that not just kind of improve air quality, but also and their emissions, but also their operations. Because a very important part of all of this is that a lot of this problem comes from the use of fossil fuels and the use of fossil fuels inefficiently. To be able to kind of solve that part of the energy mix also allows for a large part of the co-benefit to transfer to improvements in emissions and air quality. And that's really where information and incentives that come out of that are so central to how we should be thinking about the problem. Just to kind of re-emphasize that, and these are different levels of interventions that we at the Energy Policy Institute have been involved with in designing and implementing. From using this information to set very targeted and prescriptive interventions that we want everyone in the economy to take, to being able to design interventions that have the greatest impact, are able to use flexibility in operations that particularly private sector emitters can utilize, and to be able to do it in a manner that we have this information available on a continuous basis so that compliance and regulation is completely absolute and there is no leakage in the system. That's really where we want to kind of be able to kind of develop that policy toolbox that solves a lot of this problem. The two interventions that I want to kind of talk about, one I will do in the next slide, but one of these is the use of AI and ML machine learning tools to bring on bear a lot of the information that we collect on emissions and its impact on air quality. That data set that we've developed for the US EPA, and we are now working in India to do that, allows for identification of which stacks and which firms and which industries are more likely to be not in compliance of an emission standard. That allows for regulations and inspectors to be able to kind of target those stacks and those firms more actively than if they were just uniformly going across all stacks and all industries and carrying out enforcement. The use of these tools in the case of the US EPA has increased the compliance levels by 70%. And that's a remarkably high level of achievement. So that's the kind of tools that we are able to use if we have and are able to use this information effectively. The second one that I wanted to kind of talk about and spend some time talking about is the use of market-based instruments such as emissions trading scheme. Now, for those of you who may not have kind of heard of this in their previous work, emissions trading scheme is essentially a cap and trade scheme, for instance, of the like that the European Union has for carbon, or the acid rain program in the US in the 1990s, that allowed for firms as an aggregate put together to be able to meet their emission targets instead of each firm having to meet a uniform target for everyone. For firms that can do much better than their target, they are able to monetize their improved environmental performance. And for firms that are finding it harder to meet their targets, they are able to incentivize other firms by buying improved performance from those firms. The net outcome of this is the cost of compliance is lower in the market compared to a traditional command and control regime. Emission targets are more actively achieved. Enforcement is almost universal. And the creation of this market then creates a mechanism that allows for growth to happen. We are not shutting down industry because you are not compliant, but we are also meeting our overall environmental target. Now, this is a concept that's been very well understood and has been on paper for a very, very long time and has been deployed in the developed world very, very extensively. As I described, the European Union emissions trading scheme, the acid rain program in the US, a lot of other regional emission trading schemes around carbon around the world, but not in the global south. What we did was to apply this in a city called Surat in India, in the southern coast, in the western coast of India, in the textile and dyeing cluster. What we were also doing as part of that exercise was solving all of the other multidisciplinary problems that we needed to solve. So for instance, what are the devices that we would need to install to be able to measure emissions? So exactly the kind of thing that Dio was talking about, which devices work, which devices are cheaper, and which devices give me data much, much more clearly. Be able to kind of also estimate what that emission reduction at the stack has in terms of improvements in air quality, what that actually means in terms of reduction in cost of compliance, and do all of this in a manner that we are actually testing whether this as a policy tool works, estimate its actual impact, and use those results to talk about why this is a solution that can actually be deployed more actively across the global south. Having set up the world's first market for particulate matter in Surat in 2019, and having run that market for the last 7 years now, we are now in a situation where we are now offering and deploying this as a plug and play policy technical assistance program across the world. We launched this as a formal scale up activity in the New York Climate Week last September. And at this point are servicing about 5 big Indian industrial states in conversation with other parts of the world, including where you see some of these arrows going to, and with the target that by 2030 we'll have 1 billion people being able to breathe cleaner air because of an intervention of the kind that we have designed and can, which we've shown through this program, work in the global south with whatever limited regulatory capacity exists within the pollution regulators in this part of the world. So just to kind of bring it all together, we want to use information to identify what interventions are the ones that work the best, have the largest impact in terms of improvement in air quality, measure that impact in terms of its actual health and economic benefits, and use those metrics to motivate action on the part of the entire stakeholder spectrum that I described earlier: citizens, regulators, governments, as well as an industry. And that really is a bit of that integrated approach that I was starting my presentation with, where we not only have economists who kind of talk about all of these numbers in dollar or rupee terms, but also engineers who help us design and deploy systems like this. And not just engineers and economists, but for all intents and purposes, there's no version of the world where you can kind of get away by not having lawyers. Having lawyers kind of help us come in and write out regulations and laws that make a lot of this actually happen in the policy and the regulatory space. I'll stop here and again emphasize that our effort is to take this really remarkable research that comes out of universities and be able to deploy it to actually make a difference on the ground and make sure that this research is actually impactful and useful. Thank you very much for your patience, and very happy to carry on this conversation in the discussion now.
Thank you so much, Kaushik. I really enjoyed the way that you have reminded us really why we're here. It's not only the research, it is important. It is important, the measurement. We're all here also, or our intersection, our common interest is to have good policy. I think Dale also said it at the very beginning. He said, data to take action. Kaushik, you said information for impact, and later at the end of your presentation for incentives. So that's the intersection that brings us together. That's where we can start. Let me now give the floor to our final presenter, Tivrat Garg, an associate professor at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California, San Diego. Tivrat research focuses on the economic and human consequences of environmental pollution. And in particular, he looks at the effects of air pollution on productivity, on learning, on labor markets. So actually, his work makes the development case, or helps us make the development case for clean air. Tivrat, please go ahead.
Thank you, Nancy. And thank you for having me as part of this fantastic panel. It's a tough act to follow, but I'm going to try to just, I think the monitoring work that is happening, the kinds of collaborations that Kaushik was talking about are so fundamentally crucial to making progress on this issue that is obviously plaguing so many parts of the world. The goal of my presentation is going to be to get us to think about what happens like right after we do develop these like intensive monitoring networks, what the successes from this, like what that buys us, and importantly, what it doesn't buy us, and keeping our eyes open on what it doesn't buy us so that we can continue to reform the interventions that we're thinking about. This is drawing on joint work with a number of fantastic co-authors who are listed there, including Nancy, work that you and I have done together, funding from various different sources. So I just wanted to acknowledge all of that. Kaushik sort of like, laid the groundwork for this very nicely, so I don't need to get into too much of this detail. But if you think about, sort of where is this problem the worst, it is in parts of South Asia, West Africa, parts of Sub-Saharan Africa, and these are also typically been places where monitoring has been quite a bit lower, although that has definitely changed. The improvements in monitoring have definitely happened in South Asia. So we're going to sort of try to take some comparative lessons from there. I'm going to go over very quickly the takeaways from 3 different studies that we have completed or are ongoing that are in 3 different constituencies that are affected by air pollution. So a lot of this is going to be around the adaptation to air pollution rather than sort of regulatory mitigation, and how are citizens engaging, especially with levels of air pollution. So while Kaushik and his very, very impressive team work on reducing air pollution levels, ambient air pollution levels, what are people doing right now, and how are they thinking about the valuation of this air quality? And we're going to think about 3 different sectors here across Bangladesh and India: firms, households, and citizenry. In the firm setting, we've found that, even like ambient air pollution levels are obviously very high, but so are indoor air pollution levels. And that's because the built environment is set up in a way that really leads to high degree of infiltration, to the point where, indoor air pollution levels are about 80 to 85% of what they are outside. This is quite a bit of contrast from OECD countries, where infiltration tends to be much lower, about on the order of about 25%. And so being inside, even though people perceive it as being protected from air pollution, really isn't much of a protection from air pollution. And we know that air purifiers are these very cost-effective devices that can rapidly improve indoor air quality very, very quickly, very, very effectively. And this has, at least in the firms that we've worked with, this very important RMG, ready-made garment sector in Bangladesh, you get these very large productivity effects, about 10% increase in productivity, profits increase by 18%. These are annual estimates. If you look at sort of peak production months when these incentives are the largest, these numbers are absolutely astounding. And these are through gold standard randomized control trials that we've uncovered these estimates, right? And yet, we generally find that firms are not willing to pay for this. So our instinct was very much that, all right, maybe firms are just not aware of this. And we found that firms do tend to be aware somewhat of this problem, but there's just a fundamentally deeper problem that exists over here, which is that even when firms are aware that air pollution is a problem, they know that air pollution is bad for their productivity, there's so much other risk going on that their ability to think about or learn the returns to their own specific firm are quite noisy. And that means that they're not fully able to incorporate that the returns are going to be to them specifically from improvements in air quality. So when we do a study, we observe the treatment group and the control group, and that's how we think about what the treatment effect is. But the firm itself is only observing itself before and after it got, for instance, an air purifier from us. Even then, we've done some work into thinking about what kinds of contracts might increase this willingness to pay, and low-risk experiential contracts that let them try this out and learn that this improved air quality is actually benefiting them really drives up the willingness to pay. What's important to remember here is that, if you imagine if you're a 25-year-old person who was born in Nairobi or born in New Delhi, and you've never left that city, you don't know what clean air actually is, right? So that experience of what is it actually delivering for me? It's a very hard thing to learn. You can have these information campaigns, etc., but that like innate ability to learn that is actually quite fundamentally hard. And that's what we're seeing even in amongst fairly sophisticated firms. This is from the University of Chicago Air Quality Life Index. How many life years are lost in various cities? In Dhaka, we find that this is like the largest striking number, and yet fewer than 1% households. And we're talking about middle-class households who otherwise have air conditioners, run air conditioners, which are both more expensive to buy and more expensive to run, but they're not utilizing air purifiers. So we try to figure out why is this the case? And this is something that frankly resonates a lot with me. My parents live in Delhi. My co-author's parents live in Mumbai, and they don't utilize air purifiers. And they can, of course, certainly, the air purifiers are there in the room. I've even put smart plugs on their air purifiers to just check when my parents are utilizing their air purifier. They don't. And we wanted to understand what's happening here. And what's really disappointing, I guess, in some ways, is that the standard development economics toolkit of why people are not using a health-saving technology just doesn't seem to play out. Right? So giving people a free monitor, it updates their beliefs about how bad indoor air quality is, does not change their willingness to pay. We give them a free air purifier. Again, middle-class households, we compensate them for electricity use. They still use it for less than 30 minutes, less than 40 minutes a day. We show them that the real time, like decrease in PM 2.5 that's happening by showing them the demonstration of the pollution monitor and the air purifier. Again, we don't see an increase in valuation. We don't see anything with interest-free credit as well. And essentially what we find is that for some reasons, the valuation of indoor air quality improvements in even middle-class households, these are not the poorest of households, is incredibly low, close to zero. And what we're seeing, and we're seeing this by just the fact that people don't even utilize, free air purifiers that they're given to them. And I think this is like a really important area for us to think about, that the information environment is just the first step, and actually getting people to be able to protect themselves defensively is a whole nother set of things. And so finally, we want to understand that, but do people even care about air pollution? And we're doing a survey in Delhi that just concluded a couple of 2 days ago, actually. So these are fresh off the press results. And we generally find that 78% of people want the government to do more on air pollution. 40% rank air pollution as their top priority, and 73% agree that if the government will act, if the residents actually demand it. So people have very positive beliefs about both that more should be done, that they act, the government will do more, and that this is their top policy priority. Yet, when it comes down to people guessing other people's effort, like, will you contact your elected official? Will you send a letter? Will you sign a petition? People drastically overestimate what others are going to do. And in effect, what that ends up meaning is that they themselves are unwilling to take a lot of action. So they'll state that they have this interest in engaging in these activities to demand more action on air pollution, but then they end up not taking a whole lot of action. And so I think this idea, what we're exploring, is that even in information-rich environments, when people are aware that air pollution is a problem, what is stopping people from actually being able to protect themselves and demand more action, right? And so I think that this is where, even though the information environment can be very fantastic for designing and implementing regulations, when it comes in terms of how are individual citizens or households or firms responding to this, we need to think about more than just providing that information. That's a very important first step, but what do we do next that's going to be quite important? And so what we're seeing is that monitoring is, of course, absolutely necessary, but in a lot of instances, it is proving not to be sufficient. And I think a lot more work needs to be done here in order to get us to understand, in the interim, while regulation catches up and tries to make ambient air pollution levels lower, what is the role of different citizenry bodies, et cetera, in actually being able to protect themselves from air pollution and be able to demand more actions in that space. So I'll stop there and just put a little plug in here that Anand Sudarshan and I have just recently completed a synthesis on the economics of air pollution in lower and middle income countries. This is going to launch as an event with Vox Dev Literature. So if you would like to attend on June 17th, you can scan this QR code and register yourselves. And we'll go through a lot more in the details of like what the economics of air pollution looks like. I'll stop there. Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you so much, Tivrat, and thank you actually for raising this point that in the end, we know, but it's great to see the evidence. We heard from the very first presentation, data for action, information for impact. So the two I's, information for impact. But what the research that Tivrat is showing us is that it takes much more to get from one to the other. I think that's and you're showing us already a broad and important research agenda from the economic side, where questions are still open and need to be answered. So that is a great segue for our conversation. So let me start with a couple of questions, but if it's okay with everybody in the room, what I'll do is I'll bring some of the questions that are being raised already on the chat so that we bring the discussion that we had planned and the session on questions a little bit together. So just to take back to the conversation to where we started and let's say the division or the clash or not clash of disciplines. Let me start with maybe with Deo and Kaushik and ask you a little bit to maybe reflect on what we've heard and let us know what's your perception on what are your thoughts on the limits if you take the engineer and the economist approach. I know, Kaushik, you work quite a bit at the intersection, but if you have to look at each one of these two disciplines, where do you think are the limits of each one of them? And where is it that one can start benefiting from the other? Where is it that they need to start talking or speaking more to each other to break those limits? Maybe let me start with Kaushik.
Thanks, Nancy. It's a great question, and it's something that's kind of been so central to almost everything that we've done in development economics over the last 100 years. The one thing that is so important for me especially when I work with policymakers, is to always constantly remind myself of the humility of my discipline, that economics can't solve every problem. And if I assume that everything in the world, in the end, kind of is an issue about pricing or markets, it's really, I'm kind of creating a very, very false version of the world. Unfortunately, that's not something that they teach you in school. When I graduated when I graduated with a master's degree in economics, I entered the real world. I very quickly realized that the real world is a very special case, and there is only so much that I'm able to do with analysis and tools that I've learned in my school. And it's very then important for me to kind of recognize the reality of the world and design interventions accordingly. And I'll give you a concrete example here. I talked about the emissions trading scheme for particulate matter, the first one in the world that we've set up in the city called Surat for the textile and dyeing cluster. And this is a program that's been running very, very well for the last 6 years because of two things. The first, we were able to define what emissions mean in this case and essentially kind of create the decrease in emissions as a new commodity. Now, if you do not have this commodity well defined, you can't have a marketplace for it. I mean, imagine if you go to the supermarket today and you ask for a dozen bananas, you get 11, you are not going to go back to the supermarket again. So you need to have that commodity for trade very, very well defined. And that's where the measurement technology and the measurement infrastructure was so central to be able to define what that commodity looks like. That 1 ton of or that 1 kilogram of particulate matter over this period in time. The second part that I wanted to...
On that point, sorry to interrupt you, but there's one question that says, how is it that you can communicate and convincing to politicians and regulators to act? So if I have to summarize what you just said, it's really putting that number on the great.
And the second thing is to kind of recognize that this tool does not solve every environmental problem. So you can't create a cap and trade scheme for emissions that are coming from the transportation sector. That's where, for instance, interventions around catalytic converters, improvements in fuel quality, something that's kind of classically something that an automobile engineer or a petroleum engineer will be able to help design, becomes so much more important. So recognizing one's limitation, but also points of intersection is so important. And then transparently kind of presenting that information.
Dale, what's your take on this same question? I think one among the questions that I seen from the audience, they're mentioning already challenges for Africa in the measurement of air pollution. I see a question about whether low-cost sensors can include aerosols, or even addressing unique challenges in Africa on traceability. So maybe are these the limits of your discipline that you're seeing right now in Africa or not? And what are the ones that you think should be broken?
Yeah, just to, am I audible? Right.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, so yeah, so just to pick up on that, from where Kaushik started actually, that I don't think there's a particular discipline, especially for wicked problems like, say air pollution or climate change, where you can just rely on the resources of one single discipline. I think I also relate to that same, but I think I want to go to the specific that what we've also realized about time and when you're developing, the project on trying to put together the design considerations for sensing networks, not just for air pollution, but general environmental sensing in general. It's that no amount of technology or investment infrastructure on its own can move the needle in terms of moving the action forward. What do I mean? Even if we invested in bringing on board, bringing in countries, say, several reference instruments, and then just put them ultimately without recognizing the need for the human in the loop of that process, you're going to have that on its own, you won't really move far. So you'll have fancy equipment maybe sitting in the laboratory and collecting data, but then the missing link that you really need to move the actual conversion forward is important. So how do you address this? So then you look at this as, it's you then have to approach this from sort of a participatory or, transdisciplinary kind of mindset, in the sense that you're designing a network. You then also have to picture, like, is the network responsive to the local needs, and whether it's any emerging issues or any planning priorities. That way, you're already getting or securing the buy-in or even the understanding from the very beginning, from the cycle of setting up the monitoring infrastructure. So I think just summarize that you need the human in the loop, whatever angle it is from the communities or the policymakers, to be able to move, if you're setting, to move the conversation forward. So one discipline in isolation will not do so much. I think we've also seen previously in the scoping review, we found that a lot of the work happening were coming from core benefits. There's not much argument being made to say, oh, we are doing this because of air pollution, but rather, the argument is missing because the implementation, you realize, or the design is kind of happening, maybe within the bounds of the different disciplines. On the question of the different challenges, I think this is slightly technical, also slightly philosophical. The philosophical question is also how we define, quality assurance. I think in terms of the sensor application, it's not just to say, oh, we need to get the sensor and calibrate them, but I think having a whole holistic process that starts from the choice of the technology, but also going into the different ways of how, things, the governance framework around the data, the metadata, and then eventually how you then go all the way to data access. So once you get that correct, and then it will become easier to try to have some sort of a framework that is accepted. So reminds me, we have a workshop on this particular topic in Pretoria, looking at how you can strengthen data flows. But ultimately, what we want to see is have some sort of a community validated best practices framework for local sense applications that is incorporating all these different contextual issues from different corners of the continent. I'll pause there for now.
Perfect. Thank you, Del, because that actually goes to one of the questions that came up in the chat, which is about capacity building. So in places where data is not available, where the techniques are underdeveloped, how to do it. And then Del mentioned the workshop that is coming up at the forum in Pretoria. And then Pawan, maybe you can talk a little bit about what you are also planning to do in Pretoria. So let me move now to Pawan and Tivrat, and I'm going to ask you a little bit of a different question. Pawan, keep in mind that part on capacity building, but I would like you to help us reflect on the complementarity. So from your perspective as an economist and engineer, where is it that, what is it that you would like to get if you had a wish list, or if you were able to work with the other side of today's discussion, let's say, what is it that you would ask? What are the economic questions that where you need better measurement, TVRED, where you would like to have available information? Or where is it that maybe from the measurement perspective, the link to policy, the link to reforms, the link to economic cost is missing? So a little bit of a reflection of these, I think, would be great. Pawan, let me start with you.
Great. Thank you, Nancy. So I think, so from the scientist point of view, and what we are seeing in Africa, which kind of came across in multiple presentation, one is the lack of measurement on the ground, right? And one thing we have to remember, although I'm from NASA, we do a lot of work on satellite data, but satellite data cannot replace the ground measurement, okay? They are a complementary information, so we have to remember that satellite is there to help, to move things forward, to provide additional support, to provide complementary information, but they're not there to replace the ground monitors. Ground monitors provide you most accurate information, what is happening on the ground, what is happening at the nose level, okay? So even if we able to develop all the satellite products, satellite data sets for Africa, we will still need ground measurement to verify them, to make sure they are correct, they are within certain uncertainties, what we need for various application, health exposure studies, economic studies, anything. So that's one thing I want to say. Second is, by saying that satellite data does definitely provide a lot of benefits, and I think developing capacity on how to use the satellite data in Africa, from NASA side, we have several programs which actually doing that in different form, mostly online and through other platforms. But I think there can be more collaboration with the universities, with local institutions can be done, which can actually help to fill that gap and develop that capacity to utilize the satellite data in areas where it can helpful. It cannot be substitute for everything, but it can help many things. So I think I'll stop here. Those are kind of two things I would like to see.
Thank you, Pawan. Tivrat.
I think everything that I was going to say, most of it has already been said, but I think that just two quick things that I would like to add to that is that we're really at a very pivotal time in both our capacity to measure and our capacity to analyze the measurements that are happening. And I think that enabling conversations where the people who are doing one and the people who are doing the other can have ex-ante conversations that maximize the impact, I think, is going to be quite key. And this means that our ability to, leverage satellite data, to leverage low-cost real-time monitoring, but then also getting insights into places that we haven't had previously, right? Which is like, detailed indoor air pollution monitor. What is the continuous exposure that people have throughout the day? Refining, figuring out where their exposure is the highest, and doing all of that to design a suite of interventions that are targeted both in terms of like ambient reductions, but also in terms of defensive behavior. I think that is going to be where a lot of the high return investments are going to be. So I'm quite excited about that.
Great. Let me go back to Kaushik and Dale, because I think from your side and close interaction with policymakers, there's a question that is asking you for an answer that I think it's very difficult, but I'll put the question up. So is there a specific length of emission that is required to influence policy to be meaningful, especially if the place where this is going to happen does not have sensors installed yet? So if you're going to engage for impactful measurement to impact, as we heard, very difficult, what is the time frame? What have you seen from your experience? Kaushik.
So, I mean, that's a question. That's an excellent question, and coming at the fag end of this conversation, it's kind of really hard to not imagine that we probably need to spend a large amount of time having that conversation. But the short answer for that, to me, is the following. We are at that point, especially, for instance, in a city like Delhi, where, as Ivrit was showing, the health impacts of poor air quality account to about 8 years of our lives. It's really well beyond a tipping point where collecting data for a certain length of time is an important exercise. I think we are kind of at that point in time where we are able to see these impacts so visibly that the urgency for action, especially at the point of policymakers, is supremely high. To be able to do what DO does or what Pawan does and bring that information in that concretized, measured form and show that effectively to policymakers is the missing piece in large parts of the world that we live in. And that's really the gap that we are trying to solve. So it's not really a question of collecting data for a long or a short period of time, but really making that urgency visible and obvious. The moment you kind of start seeing that your people are dying because of this, I mean, I can imagine it would start to prompt action of the kind that we, for instance, see at the Maidan Revolution or the Arab Spring.
Rashid, great. I think it's very important, this point that you brought. It may take long. We're not saying it's going to be fast, but it's important to start so that change can happen. I really like that point. Dale, we're getting a lot of questions in terms of how to go over that hurdle of costs, how costly it is to start collecting the data in places where there's little capacity and no data at all. What are steps that people could think about to start moving and going beyond that hurdle?
Yeah, that's a tough one actually, but it's a very practical question. I do want to build on the point Kaushik made about making the issue urgent enough to the policymakers, because we also get this question about, like the cost of monitoring. If you're using non-government data to do monitoring, ultimately that cost need to be coming from somewhere else. But if we are going to sustain that over a longer period of time, I keep saying continuous monitoring, that means we need to move or work towards making the work for air quality closer or back to the taxpayer then referring to government. That kind of ties into the earlier question. So one, if the issue is urgent enough, or the policymakers see it as urgent, then clearly that could be one direction we can take. Obviously, that might not be the first step, And I'm glad to say that, well, this for this year's forum, there's lots of conversation around funding, how you can finance and different initiatives with different innovative models to fund air quality work. In this particular case, monitoring, and including what EPIC is doing and many other initiatives. But I think talking more sort of big picture, it's also important to also understand what we define as policy, because that's really critical, because that is not, in some cases we get varied answers, but I think my understanding is that that includes, what is intended, even the action taken. So if you're able to convince government to even start funding air quality work, that's also kind of, that's a policy commitment. If we have the equal legislation, or if we're able to have, you have the first, I don't know, have, say, car-free day, or have some incentive or mechanisms for the markets to reduce, the levies on, I don't know, whether it's cleaner cooking alternatives or vehicles, or think of anything. So I think understanding policy from a broader lens can make the earlier question actually quite easier to also approach, and that also includes look at resources to fund to support air quality work. Yeah, so no straight answer, but I think it's something that collectively as a community we can be able to, or as different disciplines for that matter, can be able to work towards having some tangible solutions.
No straight answer, Dale, because it's a very difficult question, but I think you've made a very important point. It is both in terms of time and dollars. The cost, it may take long, it may take a big amount of resources, but what we're hearing is that the cost of inaction are even higher. So important again to make to build the evidence on the costs, as Tivret was also pointing at. Let me just, we have only 3 minutes, so if I can maybe ask Tivret and Pau, and just to close, to give us, if we're thinking about a joint research agenda, what would be your 1-2 topics that you would really want to push forward together if you have to set 2 priorities? One.
I think I would like to actually have a data sharing platform where we can actually share the data among different communities. I feel like it is still very early. The data collection is in very early stage in Africa, and I think a lot of people on their own or smaller group data is collecting, and I think if that data can be shared with larger community, we can do a lot more research, and finding can help actually overall Africa move forward.
Great. Tivret.
I think 2 things that would go from my side on the research agenda. We spend a lot of time and effort at the World Bank, at various other agencies, doing a lot of outreach to households, firms, etc., through surveys, and equipping enumerators with very low cost handheld sensors that can start to get us insights into on the ground air pollution exposure would be amazing. And then I think second, which is tying in with what Kaushik had said earlier, how do we really take the information of this is bad levels of air pollution and turn it into information that leads individuals and civil society to actually act on it. I think that is a very, very fruitful area of discussion.
Well, thank you. I want to thank you guys for these great presentations, for an amazing conversation. To everybody that joined, thank you. But before we close, I want to pass the baton to Dale for him to give us a little bit of the next step into this conversation. Thank you, everybody. Dale?
Yeah, thank you, Nancy, and everyone else for a great conversation. I won't keep us longer than the time we had scheduled. The next steps, essentially, we look forward to welcome everyone in South Africa and Pretoria to continue the conversation. I believe there are several other conversations like this, maybe touching on other thematic areas and on ahead of the forum. So check out for the forum. Registration is underway. So really looking forward to welcoming everybody. And speaking of the forum, the one thing that really we are very happy about is the fact that the forum is a creation coming out of the understanding that we need to have a platform where disciplines can be able to share ideas, we can be able to collaborate and exchange knowledge, and also, build partnerships. And that's what the Cleaner Network has been doing since 2023. And I think through these different conversations, we'll be able to build some momentum, and hopefully we can restore or keep the Clean Air Hope for Africa alive. So thank you very much. And thanks again, Nancy.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.